Who are the first inhabitants of Florida, you may ask? Well, the Seminole tribe were the first inhabitants of Florida until U.S. settlers had tried to come and take their land, which resulted in 3 Seminole Wars. The Seminole Wars were one of the most important series of conflicts in American military history. Lasting from 1818 to 1858, they redefined relationships between Native Americans and European Americans in Florida. There were many triumphs and tragedies for the Seminoles during the Seminole Wars. In this documentary, we will explain to you some of the triumphs and tragedies that happened in all 3 Seminole Wars. When U.S. settlers came and tried to take the Seminoles' land and freedom, the Seminoles refused and tried to fight back, which resulted in the First Seminole War. If the Seminoles did not fight back, then they could have been enslaved or killed. The kind of tactics you could have expected the Seminoles to use during these times included guerrilla warfare tactics. Guerrilla warfare was a type of warfare fought by irregulars in fast-moving, small-scale actions against orthodox military and police forces, and on occasion against rival insurgent forces, either independently or conjunction with a larger political military strategy. The word guerrilla stems from the Duke of Wellington's campaign during the Peninsular War, in which Spanish-Portuguese irregulars, or guerrilleros, helped drive the French from the libertarian Peninsular. Over the centuries, the practitioners of guerrilla warfare have been called rebels, irregulars, insurgents, and mercenaries. Frustrated military commanders have consistently named them as barbarians, savages, terrorists, outlaws, and bandits. The First Seminole War lasted from 1817 to 1818, and the Second Seminole War lasted from 1821 to 1842, and the Third and last Seminole War lasted from 1855 to 1858.
The First Seminole War began over attempts by U.S. authorities to recapture runaway black slaves living among Seminole bands. Under General Andrew Jackson, U.S. military forces invaded the area, scattering the villagers, burning their towns, and seizing Spanish-held Pensacola and St. Mark's. As a result, in 1819, Spain was induced to cede its Florida territory under the terms of Transcontinental Treaty. The Transcontinental Treaty, otherwise known as the Florida Purchase Treaty, ceded Florida to the U.S. and defined the boundary between the United States and New Spain. According to Andrew Jackson's scripts that were published in 1817, Jackson talked about how the spring of 1818 that the Seminoles were gathering en masse in Pensacola, which at the time was in Spanish-controlled Florida. He also heard reports of Indians murdering whites in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. He was in fact sent down to Fort Scott because of Seminole retaliatory strikes against the United States in late 1817. General Jackson concluded that it was necessary for the United States to invade Spanish territory and forcibly take control of Pensacola, thereby dispersing the Indians gathered there. On May 28, 1818, he did just that. He claimed after the invasion that his action stemmed in no way from a desire to extend the territorial limits of the United States, but was instead a preventative measure against further Indian violence against whites. During the First War, there are no triumphs, only tragedies, because U.S. armed forces enslaved and killed many Seminoles, and also won the first battle.
The Second Seminole War lasted from 1835 to 1842, which followed the refusal of most Seminoles to abandon the reservation that had been specifically established for them north of Lake Okeechobee and to relocate west of the Mississippi River. Whites converted this land and sought to oust the Seminoles under the Indian Removal Act. Led by their dynamic chief Osceola, the Seminole warriors hid their families in the Everglades and fought vigorously to defend their homeland using guerrilla tactics. As many as 2,000 U.S. soldiers were killed in this prolonged fighting, which cost the government between $40 million and $60 million. Only after Osceola's capture while parleying under a flag of truce did Indian resistance decline. With peace, most Seminoles agreed to immigrate. This picture, that was made in 1838 by George Catlin, represents how Chief Osceola was a fierce leader who brought faith and hope into his tribe. One triumph that happened during the Second Seminole War was when Chief Osceola created many great battle tactics that frustrated many U.S. Army generals. One tragedy that happened during the Second Seminole War was when Chief Osceola died in prison. Chief Osceola was a huge inspiration for Seminole people because he was a great warrior and leader.
The Third Seminole War, the last war between the settlers and Seminole Indians in Florida, lasted from 1855 until 1858. The war was also known as the Billy Bowlegs War because he was the main Seminole leader in the third and last war. The Seminoles won this war against the U.S. and could stay in Florida. According to Billy Bowlegs' journal entries that were published in 1856, Bowlegs talked about how war broke out for the third and final time between the settlers and the Seminole Indians, primarily over land disputes, and by the conclusion of the war, there were less than 200 remaining Seminoles in Florida. After the war, Billy Bowlegs and his family migrated to Indian Territory in Oklahoma under the terms of surrender. One triumph during the last Seminole War was that Billy Bowlegs led Seminoles to a victory against the United States Army. One tragedy during the last Seminole War was that many Seminoles lost their lives as the result of this victory over the United States Army. This Seminole War was the most important war for the Seminoles because they had finally gained their freedom and land against the U.S. Army.
In conclusion, the First Seminole War lasted from 1817 to 1818, and the Seminoles lost this war against President Andrew Jackson and his men. During this war, Jackson's men defeated the Seminoles by hunting them down and putting them in prisons or killing them. The Seminoles did not have any triumphs during this time, only tragedies of their brothers being killed in battle next to them.
The Second Seminole War lasted from 1835 to 1842. In this war, the United States wanted the Seminoles to move to the reservation that had been assigned to them, but the Seminoles refused, and this is how the Second Seminole War began. Chief Osceola was a huge inspiration to all Seminole people, which is why when he died, it was a huge tragedy for the Seminole people. When Osceola was alive, though he created many great battle tactics that made many generals mad, which was a huge triumph for the Seminole people. Even though Osceola created many great battle tactics, the Seminole people still lost the war.
The last and final war lasted from 1855 to 1858. This war was also known as the Billy Bowlegs War because Bowlegs was one of the fierce leaders of this time who helped the Seminole people win the third and last Seminole War. After this war was over, Billy Bowlegs and his family migrated to the Indian Territory for a better life. The result of winning this war caused tragedy for the Seminole people, mainly because so many people had lost their lives. The major triumph for the Seminole people in this war was the Seminole winning this third and final war, which allowed them to stay in Florida and continue with their lives without being attacked or taken away from their homes and families. The Seminole Wars were some of the most important wars for Florida history. These wars included many triumphs and tragedies for the Seminole people, and ultimately shaped Florida and the people who lived there for the better.